Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you yet again for tuning in. My name is Christopher Shepard. We should have another great show for you today, coming off of a fantastic show yesterday. Today, since it's an off day in the NBA, we will be kind of giving a series update in today's show between the Celtics and the Mavs and kind of looking at the volatility of both the fantasy stats and the finals MVP odds now. We'll be recapping the Panthers. I will call this one more dominant of a win in Game 2 in the Stanley Cup Finals. And stick around for the latter half of the show. We'll have some interesting segments where I bring in fantasy football to the table. I talk about players who ESPN believes will exceed their projections. I talk about the MVPs and LVPs of the fantasy basketball season, and also give you guys a way too early fantasy basketball mock draft with some very exciting picks. So that should be a can't miss segment. But as always, before we begin with today's show, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe. As always, if you would like to leave a tip or donation, if you do feel so inclined, leave it at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the overall network. So everything that goes there is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let us get straight into the show and let us start off with a very interesting segment. I know that since there's an off day in the NBA Finals, we can't really talk about previewing a game or betting odds, but we will have a very special segment where I kind of update you guys on what's going on, both fantasy-wise and also in terms of the Finals MVP odds, because they have been very volatile. Now, as a whole, when I think about this series in terms of how it's going in fantasy, I think of the word conundrum, because you have this case of there being an all-world fantasy player in Luka Doncic of the Dallas Mavericks, who is doing everything he can to propel his team forward in some fashion against a very dominant, well-based, structured team in the Boston Celtics. And it is highly reflected in the fantasy stats, because right now, looking at the overall stats as well, Luka Doncic leads in all but two of the categories in the NBA Finals in terms of stats, including the fantasy points, by a wide margin. However, basketball is often referred to as a team game, and there is no better team, better structured and well-built than the Boston Celtics. And that is also reflected in the fantasy stats as well, because looking at the overall fantasy stats, Luka leads it by a wide margin, and deservedly so, because he's still putting up the stats no matter how his teammates perform, irregardless of them. However, after him, 4 Celtics are on this list. That just goes to show you the depth that the Celtics can rely on, both in real life and in fantasy. And for you guys, that is why I think of the word conundrum, because when you're picking especially a daily fantasy basketball team, yes, you kind of want that middleman that's between your top point scorer like a Luka Doncic and then your bench players, but the Boston Celtics just have a myriad number of them. You can't quite decide on who is going to be the best fantasy player for them because they don't even know. They just play within their system so well, and they spread the ball around, they spread the wealth around so well that anyone on any given night can perform both on the court and in fantasy. Like last game, Drew Holiday surprisingly stepped up with a fantastic shooting night. He is more well known for his defense, but on that night, he was A, the best Celtics player on the court, and B, their best player in fantasy. In Game 1, we saw 2 guys step up. Kristaps Porzingis coming back from injury. Huge fantasy game, huge game on the court. Obviously, he didn't play the full game because he was trying to working his way back, but he still had a fantastic on-the-court game, and it translated in fantasy. Jaylen Brown also had a fantastic fantasy game, as well as on the court in Game 1. Looking at the fantasy stats, though, Drew Holiday right now is the number one Celtic in terms of fantasy stats, with 49.7 points, which should be surprising considering the fact that he's not known as a point producer. He's more known for his steals and blocks, which, while very valuable in categories leagues, points leagues as well, maybe not as much in daily fantasy, but still, based off of that one game where Drew Holiday, for whatever reason, decided that he was going to be the Celtics' best player in that regard, he stepped up to the plate and delivered in fantasy, and now he sits behind Luka, who is exponentially ahead of everyone else. But that does not matter because the other three guys behind him are all Boston Celtics. JT as well, sitting at 46.8%. We've talked so many times on this show about Jason Tatum, not only as an on-the-court player, but as a fantasy player because of the fact he's so controversial and a little bit kind of maligned in the fantasy world because of the fact he's not necessarily known for giving you points. In terms of daily fantasy, points might be more integral to you winning than, say, in a points or categories league. However, since he's such a well-rounded player and was willing to do whatever the team asks of him, and being that sacrificial kind of guy on the court, he does kind of elevate his status in terms of the fantasy world because of the way he plays. He's an all-around player. He doesn't necessarily play for points. He plays for the team. Then you look at a guy like Jaylen Brown, who surprisingly, after a solid game one, is only 5th in terms of fantasy points in this series at 39.3. He just is another one of those guys who is kind of seen as the best player on the Celtics. Jason Kidd certainly thinks so. But still, he is one of those guys who on any given night can be one of the best players on the team. These guys don't necessarily care if they go off for 40 points. They don't do that. They're not Luka Doncic. They don't revolve around a superstar and rely on any particular player to give them that production. Jaylen Brown is the perfect example of that. Right now he sits 5th after having 2 of the better games for any Boston Celtic in the finals, and he's still the lowest of them in the top 5, which impresses me. And then you have a guy in Derek White, who is also a very, very intriguing fantasy player. Because he also is known for his more defensive kind of style of play in a position where you're more expected to score. And B, he owns a backcourt with Drew Holiday, who may, on any particular night, produce more than him. So Derek White sitting at 41 fantasy points overall just goes to show that Boston Celtics are the most versatile team in terms of how they produce fantasy points. We'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow in another segment, but the Boston Celtics are best equipped for balance. If you're a person who wants to build a fantasy team around balance, choose a Boston Celtic. They don't even have to start for them to, help or provide for your daily fantasy points, categories, league kind of deal, whatever you play in. They don't necessarily have to be a guy you start immediately. They can be a guy off the bench. That's just how deep they are. And looking at these fantasy stats and seeing that discrepancy between all the Dallas Mavericks just goes to show why the Celtics are in the lead in this series and ultimately my pick to win it all. But just because of the fact that on the court they deliver, and in fantasy they're just so well balanced. Now, like I said, we're going to move on to the volatility not only of the fantasy side of things, but also the finals MVP odds. The finals MVP odds we've already talked about a lot on this show as well because of the fact that you have a guy in Luka Doncic who ultimately should be the favorite, but on a team that's not as experienced in the final as the Boston Celtics, obviously he can't necessarily be that top guy. So, just looking over the finals MVP odds at the current moment, Jason Tatum surprisingly is still the number one betting favorite in terms of finals MVP. I think that could change based on what happens in the coming games. But there he sits at plus 125. And look at this. Jaylen Brown is now the second favorite for the Finals MVP. I think that this is a well-deserved. He was obviously the Eastern Conference Finals MVP. So this is a well-deserved rise up the MVP ladder in terms of betting odds for Jaylen Brown. And ultimately, I think he can be a very interesting bet for you guys that definitely could stand to make profit for you should you go that way. Luka Doncic dropping a little bit, but look at this. Drew Holiday is now the fourth betting favorite, where Kyrie Irving was a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago even. Drew Holiday at plus 750 is now the fourth betting favorite. And it just goes to show you that when you are playing a team like the Celtics and you're a superstar like Luka Doncic, you basically have to rely on the fact that you must win a game. Because I've mentioned it before, Luka Doncic is one of those guys who I think could win MVP in a losing effort. We haven't seen it that much in sports, and Luka Doncic might be one of the more deserving people to be considered for that kind of thing. But still, it's the Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics are a system team. They will always, no matter in what ranking, always outrank you. They don't have to be high in the rankings because of the fact they spread the wealth around. They just have to be there. They just have to creep up on you and ultimately grab things away from you. They're a team that has just been so well structured. Kudos to Brad Stevens for finding players that he wants to fit into his system, play unselfish basketball, and have it reflected not just in real life, but in the fantasy realm as well. And that is why the Boston Celtics are where they are, up 2-0 in the finals. But that was such an exciting segment. I hope you guys liked it. Coming up next, we are going to be recapping a very, very interesting Panthers-Oilers Game 2 in the Stanley Cup Finals yesterday. It's a can't-miss segment. There's a lot to discuss there. We'll be right back for that segment right away.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the...
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. As always, in this kind of finals time, we switch from basketball to hockey, where Game 2 of the Stanley Cup Finals between the Panthers and Oilers took place. And to be honest with you guys, this kind of was more dominant than decisive for the Florida Panthers. A 4-1 victory, ultimately. And it just goes to show you that, much like the Boston Celtics in the NBA, the Florida Panthers are another team that is just so well structured and will always be there in the end. But before we get into that kind of mindset, let's transition to the fantasy stats from last night and who the fantasy stars for this game were. Obviously, you always got to talk about him when you talk about the Florida Panthers. One of the main reasons why they are even here. The brick wall that is Sergei Bobrovsky. Not as many fantasy points as his shutout game 1 win because he did not face a high level of shots. 5.6 on the night. 1 goal, but only 18 shots he faced. Still a very solid performance from him. But if you want an unsung hero for this Florida Panthers team that's really stepped up his game very unexpectedly, how about second-line winger Evan Rodriguez, 8.5 fantasy points last night, 1 plus minus, 2 goals last night, and 3 goals in 2 games ultimately in this series. Just the depth of this Florida Panthers team is what is carrying them right now, and it is scary to behold. Speaking of depth, Anton Lundell, another fantastic game from him, the third line center. 6.5 fantasy points, 2 assists, 1 plus minus. Did not have any points the last game in Game 1, so just goes to show all these Florida Panthers players are stepping up. On the Edmonton Oilers side of things, I can really only mention 2 players because they're the only 2 players who got a goal and an assist. The only goal and assist in Edmonton Oilers Cup run right now. Connor McDavid got the assist, only 4.5 fantasy points, 1 plus minus, and Matthias Ekholm with somehow 7 fantasy points in a game where he lost by 3 goals as a defenseman. He obviously scored the only goal for the Oilers in this series. Now, I really think that this just felt like a neck-on-throat performance by the Florida Panthers. Obviously, when you look at the Edmonton Oilers, yes, they have the kind of fundamental game plan in certain aspects of the way they play that could be able to pull out a game or 2 against Florida, but ultimately Florida just looks better prepared. They absorb the Edmonton Oilers with relative ease. They have a mindset both defensively and in the attack in both zones, and right now they're just sucking the energy out of an Edmonton Oilers team that has had a fantastic run to this point. If you're the Edmonton Oilers, you just have to hope right now. That's the only thing I can think about to get back into the series. And right now, the only 2 things in my mind in which the Oilers can bank on perhaps getting better as this series progresses are the 2 strengths they've had both in the regular season and the postseason. Their power play and their penalty kill. Because right now, that is where they look like they have their priorities set. In even strength, they just look lifeless. They look lost. Their main source of attack in even strength right now is basically either Connor McDavid or whatever line is playing's main center just racing up the ice and hoping guys follow him. And it's just slow in the build-up in the offensive zone when you just need more speed. The goal here for Edmonton is to move Sergei Bobrovsky's sightline. Right now, Sergei Bobrovsky is too comfortable. You're not getting shots from unexpected places. Yes, you had a couple of key moments last night where you kind of created different shots, but right now, the name of the game for Edmonton is just creating even more shots in ways they know they can. That's the best way to put it right now. So, let's go to the Edmonton power play, for example. The Edmonton power play is so potent because the Edmonton Oilers know how they're going to set up each and every single occasion, no matter what line. Let's say it's the first line, the first power play unit. You have Connor McDavid entering the offensive zone. He's going to be the maestro. He's going to pull the strings. He's going to try and find the pass. He's going to try to drive past the net and pull it back for Zach Hyman. Zach Hyman is ultimately, in my opinion, the most pivotal player in both even strength and in the power play for Edmonton right now, because he's the guy who's mainly going to be tasked with kind of screening Sergei Bobrovsky, kind of distracting him, kind of pulling away his sight line so that other guys can get more shot production. But ultimately, he as well needs to be able to produce a tap-in. Obviously, Sergei Bobrovsky is so strong at stopping shots in the 5-hole that Edmonton really needs to figure out a way to just get one past him, and maybe it opens up Bobrovsky a little bit more. But Zach Hyman in that role just needs to make himself more of a presence, especially in terms of the power play, because that's where Edmonton needs to take advantage. And then there's Leon Draisaitl. Leon Draisaitl is on the other side of the ice, on the right wing. And ultimately, right now, he's probably the most dangerous player in the Edmonton's first power play unit. I think that his tight angle shot last night proved that he can be one of those missing pieces to the puzzle in terms of trying to find ways past Bobrovsky where it's not conventional, try and tap it in, or a Bouchard long-range shot, which we'll get to in a minute. So Leon Draisaitl just needs to develop more ways to kind of distract from what McDavid wants to do, which is enter the zone and then pass back out. So Leon Draisaitl in the series is definitely going to be pivotal, especially as it shifts to Edmonton. And last but not least, one of the more intriguing aspects of this Edmonton power play is Evan Bouchard, the farthest person out of sight of the offensive zone, kind of on the edge between the neutral zone and the offensive zone, and he's known for his long-range shots. That's his forte, and the reason why he's one of the best goal scorers and point scorers in the NHL playoffs right now. Evan Bouchard, ultimately, in my opinion, is the second most pivotal player on the Edmonton power play because in terms of shot stopping, Sergei Bobrovsky is not as strong on his blocker side, both of his blocker sides, where he has long-range shots that either go over his shoulder or above his pads. He's not as good as that as saving shots in the 5-hole. So Edmonton really needs shots that are elevated, that are above his blockers, above his pads, that can find the way into the back of the net, and Evan Bouchard is the player for that. I've talked about it yesterday. I'm going to talk about it again now because that's the main bread and butter for Edmonton right now. You have to understand that Sergei Bobrovsky can only be beat in so many different ways. And right now, that's probably your best shot. Obviously, their goal last night was kind of a tap-in where Sergei Bobrovsky somehow let it through his legs. Matthias Ekholm kind of got off the hook for kind of a bad shot, in my opinion. But still, that's the way you get past Bobrovsky. You elevate your shots, try and get it over his big glove side, blocker side, pad, what have you. That's the main way forward. In terms of the penalty kill, honestly, I never thought I would be saying this, but right now, in terms of fantasy and in real life as well, I'm high on Oilers defensemen. I don't think they're necessarily the problem. It's just the fact that the Panthers just have their offensive game plan down pat. They're just so interconnected with each other no matter how you transition from line to line. It just really gasses this Oilers defense that right now is playing kind of decent hockey. I can't really say they're doing anything poorly. I know that Chris Knoblauch wants to rotate in and out as the series develops and as defensemen kind of underperform. But still, I do think that right now the Oilers' strengths in this series are the defensemen. And obviously, that comes with Stuart Skinner as well. And he's a different issue. But right now, the Oilers need to bank on their penalty kill. I think their penalty kill was one of their bright spots last night. They did have some decent penalty kills last night. Obviously, the loss of Warren Foegele was huge for Edmonton because not only is he a fantastic two-way center, it really kind of changed Chris Knoblauch's initial plan defensively, where he needed that more physical kind of center. But still, I just think that the Florida Panthers are just handling everything as it comes. They know how to shut down superstars. They've seen kind of these superstar teams in the Eastern Conference, not to the extent of the Oilers, but still, it's just prepared them. They've been here before. They have the Stanley Cup final experience that Edmonton can't necessarily rely on, and their team is just so well built. Kudos to Bill Zito for finding guys much like Brad Stevens in the NBA. We're going to talk about this also tomorrow when I go more in depth on these two teams and how they were built. But still, the Florida Panthers right now are just absorbing everything Edmonton throws at them. And Edmonton look meeker than they've ever been right now. They look lifeless. So, for Florida, the goals moving forward, just stay the way you are playing right now because honestly, it's carrying you to that first Stanley Cup final in franchise history. This could be a sweep if Florida just stays within their system, keep doing what they're doing. Edmonton, power play and penalty kill. It's what got you here in the first place, so rely on that. But that should just about do it for this segment. I love talking about these different finals. It's honestly so exhilarating and thrilling to be able to have two fantastically weird and wacky finals in very different sports. So I'm just glad that I'm able to get to talk about them with you guys. But coming up next, we are transitioning to the fantasy kind of basketball, football world now that these seasons are finishing up. And we are going to be coming back a segment about fantasy football and who ESPN believes will exceed their projections for next season. Should be a good one. We will be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed that finals talk. There should be more of it, but before we get back into the segment, I want to remind you again that if you would like to leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud is a huge support to the network, both me and my fellow podcasters, so do please consider that. But let's get right into the meat and bones of the show, the latter portion of the show. Should be some can't miss segments here because of the fact that right now we are kind of, as these basketball and hockey seasons finish up, transitioning to the NFL season where we're really going to get in depth there. But for now, we're just going with the flow of what ESPN gives us based off of who they think are going to be bounced back like we saw yesterday, who's overvalued, undervalued even, and different rankings for different leagues. So it's going to get right down into the nitty-gritty as we get closer to the start of the NFL season. But right now, the segment that I'm going to be presenting to you guys is going to be a nice little segment, I think. It's who ESPN believes, rather, will exceed the projections they have set for the 24-25 season. So players who are expected to overperform, shall we say. And this list of players definitely is very diverse in that you have guys who know they have the traits, the untapped potential to perform for you in fantasy leagues, whichever league you may decide to be in. And you have guys who really haven't been on people's radar but have shown flashes of what they can be. And it should be a fantastic list that I'm presenting to you guys. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And let's start off kind of in the receiver realm because I really like this guy and I really think he's going to be one of the better fantasy wide receivers this year because of the fact he now gets an established quarterback to play with. And that, of course, is Drake London. Right now, he's projected to have over 1,000 yards. Even with guys like Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota at the QB position, he still has had 1,000-yard seasons in each of his first 2 seasons in the league. So, as we all know, Drake London is not necessarily a slouch, by no means, but it just goes to show that when you bring in an established veteran quarterback with a guy like Kirk Cousins, who's worked in an offensive scheme where he's had fantastic players at his disposal, he's had receivers like Jefferson and Thielen over the years, he has tight ends like Hawkinson, such fantastic skill position players. Now he goes to a Falcons team who does have that similar setup, but they haven't really broken out in my opinion. They have the guys, they just needed the quarterback. And so Drake London will be one of the beneficiaries of that. He's projected to have over 1,000 yards, like I said, 7 TDs, and if you're in a PPR league, this is very important for you guys, 84 receptions. I think that Drake London as a fantasy prospect is one of those guys who might have to get a little acclimated to the style that Kirk Cousins plays. I think it's going to be much more fast-paced, anticipatory throws, kind of short to intermediate routes that the Falcons will be using. Obviously, I don't see Raheem Morris as much of an offensive mind, so we'll definitely have to see how certain implements of the offense work. But I do think that the Falcons have a chance to be one of the more exciting offenses in the league, whereas they were one of the more disappointing ones in recent years. And Drake London, I really do think can be in that at least wide receiver 10 to 15 range. I don't necessarily think he's ready to make that leap to the top 5 just yet, but who knows? With Kirk Cousins at the helm, I do think he does have a fighting chance of being one of the top wide receivers in terms of fantasy. Moving on to another guy that kind of broke out onto the scene in very, very unexpected fashion for one of the speediest teams in the NFL in the Miami Dolphins, in Devon Achane. Last year, he averaged 17.3 PPR points. That's an astonishing number for a running back, in my opinion. So it just goes to show how much Tua relied on him out of the backfield last year. And I think that, the Dolphins obviously use a lot of running back sets. They don't necessarily rely on running back sets as much because of the fact they have so many different receivers and skill position weapons at their disposal. They're just so scary with the way they beat you with their speed and pace. But Devon Achane, averaging 17.3 PPR points as a rookie no less, in a Miami Dolphins system that doesn't necessarily rely too much on the run, is a scary proposition for him going into a second season where I really think he has the opportunity to break out. Next season, ESPN projects him to have 47 receptions, pretty good, 739 rushing yards, so a little bit of a regression to the mean. Obviously, you have to put into the mix a guy like Raheem Mostert. He's been fantastic for the Miami Dolphins ever since he came in. He does have 6 touchdowns, but receiving yards to the air is something that I really appreciate about a guy like Devon Achane, because that's where you really get that receiving kind of running back hybrid deal there. 345 yards to the air and 3 touchdowns. Very nice projections for him. Ultimately, the Miami Dolphins are in a division where I think it's very winnable for them. Obviously, Buffalo lost a lot of production on their offense. Who knows what Aaron Rodgers will look like for the Jets? I do think they can have a fighting chance of winning that division, but still. And then you have the Patriots. But still, the Miami Dolphins are a very well-structured team, and Devon Achane's transition to a sophomore season in the NFL, I think, will be one of the more seamless ones. Speaking of kind of transitions and breakout stars, how about Jake Ferguson, the tight end for the Dallas Cowboys? A guy who really wasn't on anyone's radar, I don't think, over these past couple of years because of the fact the tight end market has grown and risen exponentially in terms of fantasy. We'll talk about a little bit about that as well in the coming episodes. But Jake Ferguson is an example of how the tight end market is ever evolving. People are modeling their games after their idols like Travis Kelce and Tony Gonzalez. And Jake Ferguson is becoming part of that young, up-and-coming tight end market. I think that he is going to be very vital for this Cowboys offense because it can't just be CeeDee Lamb. Obviously, one of the number one receivers in the NFL, if not the number one receiver in people's minds. But I do think that Dak Prescott definitely loves the security blanket, and look for Jake Ferguson to produce in the red zone much like he did last season. He is a huge red zone threat in my opinion. He's going to get a lot of touchdowns, a lot of production there. So I definitely agree with ESPN on this one. Jake Ferguson is a sleeper tight end pick. Next year he's projected to have 65 receptions for over 670 receiving yards and 5 TDs. I think his TDs total is going to go over that. I think that especially if you're in a PPR league and you want those red zone receptions and also getting those points through touchdowns scored, Jake Ferguson might be your guy to look at. I think he is very versatile in the way Dallas likes to set up in the red zone. One of the better red zone offenses for quite some time last year. Due to Jake Ferguson's size, his verticality, he really is a very appealing player. But ultimately, those 3 players, in my mind's eye, are 3 spectacularly good players to rely on later in drafts. If you're looking for that one guy who you might want to take a flyer on, and the risk will certainly maybe pay off. I do think that ESPN got this right on the money. I think that of all 3 of those players, I do expect Drake London to be the guy who really does exceed his projections just because of the versatility of the other 2's offenses. But overall, another fantastic list. inspiring me from ESPN to share with you guys for the future. But coming up next, this is a way too early fantasy basketball mock draft. I know you guys are probably recovering from a very long fantasy basketball season already, and probably this is the last thing on your mind, but I'm giving it to you guys nevertheless. It should be a can't miss segment. I'm really excited to present this to you guys, so we will be right back with that mock draft. Should be exciting.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are in the home stretch of the show. I really hope you appreciated that kind of interesting segment as we transition to the football season. I know it's going to get more amped up as the football season starts, but still, I'm just glad to present that to you guys. But coming up next, we know we're finishing a grueling fantasy basketball season, but I just wanted to offer you guys a recent mock draft I did for fantasy basketball. Way too early fantasy basketball mock draft. But I think that this one is very exciting, mainly due to the level of players I've got on this team. A lot of talent, both in my starting lineup and on my bench. So without further ado, let's get right into this segment. Starting off with the whole format of this. It was a snake draft. I picked second overall, so very high pick for me. This is in a head-to-head points league, so very popular league for ESPN. If you use that platform, this is the segment for you guys. So starting off, obviously, the second overall pick. Nikola Jokic obviously went number one, but Luka Doncic is a fantastic second option. Probably the best fantasy player in the world right now. I mean, he is just leaps and bounds over everyone else, and to prove that, you see it in the NBA Finals. Even in a losing effort, Luka Doncic just does it all. And this season, he had 4,167.4 fantasy points. Not too shabby. When all is said and done, Luka Doncic could be one of those players to break the top 10 of greatest fantasy basketball players in my mind. He's just that good. He produces at all levels, a triple-double machine who is a no-brainer in any fantasy basketball lineup, whether daily, points, categories, what have you. Luka Doncic can get you so much production. He can even get you half of your points in one game. He's that crazy. Just a fantastic all-around player, and I'm glad to have him. He is in my point guard position, just to show the versatility he can be. You can use him in a utility role on different game days. So Luka Doncic just had to be. Coming in my shooting guard position is a guy in Jalen Brunson who really may fall off a little bit. He may regress to the mean because obviously he had to do a lot for the Knicks as injuries piled up for them last year. But still, he's a metronomic point guard who facilitates the basketball well. He fits very well for what the Knicks want to do. And ultimately, he is their number one option still. I don't necessarily believe they have a quote-unquote number two option. Jalen Brunson is their guy, number 1A, 2, maybe even 2A for this Knicks team. That's just how reliable he is at the shooting guard position after I drafted Luka at the point guard spot for both the New York Knicks and you in fantasy. I think this is a fantastic pickup for any squad. I think that Jalen Brunson, whether he plays at point guard or shooting guard, I don't know if you guys want to get into that hybrid role debate, but he still is a fantastic point guard who just gets the job done. Maybe not as high in defensive stats as one would like at a shooting guard position, but still, Jalen Brunson gets you that high level of point production that I really like. 3,304.1 fantasy points last season, if you care. probably my most interesting player, and a player who I kind of took a flyer on at my small forward spot, Brandon Ingram, the slender man himself. He is one of those guys who, for the most part, can be an interesting fantasy basketball player. He had 2,282 points, 0.3 points. Not bad for a small forward. Obviously, the small forward, not necessarily one of the more important positions in fantasy basketball. So it was kind of one of those things where I didn't necessarily care that he fell into my lap. But last year, he was 36th in usage rate. So just go to show the high risk, high reward kind of style that Brandon Ingram offers. But he is in a Pelicans team where, they're trying to build something, they're trying to build structure around mainly their front court. Obviously, they have Zion, and when he's healthy, they definitely get boosted. They have guys on the perimeter like Jose Alvarado and Herb Jones who provide more defense. And somewhere in the middle, you have to have a guy like Brandon Ingram who can also score at a high level. He actually did have more points last year than, or rather not, he did have the fewest points actually on my squad as I'm looking at my notes here. But still, Brandon Ingram is one of those guys who you can't necessarily ignore because small forward can swing the game in your favor, but can also be non-important if your top point guards or centers really step up to the plate. So Brandon Ingram, it is what it is. I accept him as one of my players for my mock draft, but probably not for a real-time draft because of the fact there might be better guys out there. But speaking of no-brainer picks, obviously I have Luka at my point guard spot. This was a no-brainer pick. Anthony Davis. I don't necessarily care about the Lakers' new coaching, how that kind of reshuffles the team mindset. Anthony Davis had his best year of all time last year. 40-point average when he played. Obviously, there are still questions about his injury history, and rightly so. But Anthony Davis, the fact of the matter is, he was a fantastic fantasy basketball player last year. Top 10. Insane stats for fantasy basketball. 3,807.2 points last year. That's pretty close to Luka in terms of stat production in fantasy. Not many people are close to Luka, but that's pretty damn close for Anthony Davis. And so, Anthony Davis fitting into my squad as a no-brainer. And then the center position, obviously, they're there. They always sneak up on you. He's a Boston Celtic. Kristaps Porzingis. Now, obviously, this season, kind of had to fit into the Celtic structure. He did have his best scoring season and stat line this past year with the Celtics, but still, Kristaps Porzingis is one of those fantasy players who doesn't necessarily fit into the Celtics fantasy conundrum because he's not necessarily going to be one of the higher fantasy point scores for them. That's up to the JTs and JBs of the world. But Kristaps Porzingis is one of those players just solid. He can come off the bench, can start some of the time if you feel he has a nice little matchup. So he's one of those guys who I'm confident I can reshuffle my roster with when necessary. He can move in and out of the lineup if need be. Speaking of bench, I think I have two very interesting bench players. Franz Wagner and Tyler Hero. Franz Wagner I'm really excited to have on my bench because he's in a young up-and-coming Magic team that's really building around their front court. They're really starting to mesh together, and I think the Magic will have a fantastic year. And Franz Wagner will be one of the reasons why. A fantastic rebounder, offensively and defensively. Fantastic overall defensive player. Maybe lacking a little bit in offensive production. Not one of the better kind of shooting forwards in the front court for fantasy purposes, but still a fantastic fantasy season last year, especially if you're considering him as a bench player. 2,352.7 points for him last season. So Franz Wagner, I'm really confident can be a very fantastic sleeper utility player for you. Another of those guys, I think of him and KP kind of being those interchangeable power forward / center hybrids that can really help a squad pull out a game. So I do believe that those two can be kind of pivoting in and out of the lineup, and it will work in terms of center production. And then a guy off the bench who would kind of like, just for his three-point efficiency, the way he plays the game of basketball to get as many 3 points as possible. Maybe a nice little add to the bench if you want, more points scored than, a categories league. And Tyler Hero, only 1,396.4 fantasy points last year. So he's definitely one of those guys who has a high risk, high reward kind of appeal to him. But still, he's going to chuck up a huge number of threes, and more often than not, they go in. He's had a fantastic 3-point field goal percentage and efficiency rating in the past. So Tyler Hero, rounding out my bench, is one of those guys who I might not play as often. He's there if I need him, but he could be fun to utilize, especially if you want a little bit of oomph off your bench, and if you're kind of lacking behind, and if you're in a categories league and you need more points, especially 3-pointers, then Tyler Hero might be an interesting option. But that will just about do it for this very early fantasy basketball mock draft. I hope you guys liked it. I really liked it because I got the chance to pick Luka. I may never get the chance to pick Luka again because I'll probably be picking lower in different leagues. But ultimately, I really, really like this squad, especially for a mock draft, because you have players who are so diverse. You have players that I took flyers on, who I might not necessarily have taken flyers on if I were in a real-time draft. So it was just a nice little experiment, just a kind of nice way to kind of hype up the fantasy basketball realm as the NBA Finals are winding down. So just a nice little segment there. But for today's last segment of the show, stick around. We are going to be talking about the MVPs and LVPs of the fantasy basketball season. Guys who really rose to the occasion, unsung heroes, and then the disappointments of fantasy basketball. It should be a fantastic segment to close out the show. You don't want to miss it. We will be right back with that. Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you liked my way too early fantasy basketball mock draft. I did because, like I said before, it's Luka Mania, guys. Can't get over that guy. But rounding out the show should be another interesting fantasy basketball segment. We transition from mock drafts to kind of a sadder one because as we're winding down the fantasy basketball season, it's kind of a review of how it went. We're going to be talking about the MVPs and LVPs, the unsung heroes and disappointments, like I said before the break, of fantasy basketball this season. We've talked a lot about some of these MVPs, but not necessarily these LVPs, so I'm really excited to talk about them. So without further ado, I do have a graphic for you guys today. Let's get right into it. So as you can see, as these players pass across my screen, you have a very diverse list for both. You have guys who maybe if they stayed on the court could be top 20 or so fantasy players in my opinion. But you also have guys who kind of have been the unsung heroes and you expect them to be. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off with the MVPs. The number one projected fantasy basketball player as he flashes across my screen for next year, Victor Wembanyama. Wemby, number 15 pick in ADP as a rookie. That's absolutely incredible. It just goes to show you how much hype is surrounding this young man as he acclimates to the NBA. And I think he acclimated just fine. He was a top 10 player in points format scoring for fantasy. Ultimately, though, I do think, as crazy as it is to say, he does need a little room for improvement. Obviously, he's not the bulkiest of guys, so if he bulks up, I do think he will improve. He can get more physical. Then he'll be able to get even more rebounds, and he might even be at Jokic, Luka levels in terms of production, should he decide to improve his physicality in this offseason. And also, I think that there are questions surrounding whether or not Greg Popovich is the right coach to kind of elevate his style of play. I think that Greg Popovich has done a fantastic job with the Spurs over the years, but it is a new NBA and is ever evolving, and Greg Popovich right now has not proven that he can evolve with it. You have seen older coaches kind of accept the fact that they need to transition to the more modern game, like Rick Carlisle. That's the main reason the Indiana Pacers got as far as they did. Tom Thibodeau even. So I think that Greg Popovich might hinder Victor Wembanyama should he stay for a little bit longer. But Victor Wembanyama, ultimately, it is up to him how he wants to progress. I think his mindset right now is just, okay, seeing the level of play in the NBA, the physicality of it, and how he can become better. And if he does, it's a scary proposition for the league. Right now, he's on a Spurs team that's just trying to piece together a semblance of a squad that can compete in a very crowded Western Conference. And Victor Wembanyama is just a small part of it right now, but he's going to be a huge part of it as it progresses. And so I'm really intrigued to see if Victor Wembanyama is willing to put in the work to become maybe the number one fantasy basketball player, as many people project next season. But moving on to, come on, this guy just keeps on showing up. He just keeps on showing up. Luka Doncic. What more can we say about this young man that hasn't been said before? You guys are probably sick and tired of hearing the name Luka Doncic over and over again on this show, but you just have to accept because he's that damn good. Just averages so many points. 33.9 points last season. 9.2 rebounds. 11.8 assists. Jeez. 49% from the floor. Just an absolutely incredible fantasy player. And when all is said and done, like I said last segment, he is so good that he could join Dirk as the only two Mavs in the history of fantasy basketball to be in the top 10 of the greatest fantasy basketball players of all time. Luka Doncic is a no-brainer. You better hope you have the first, second, or even third pick if he falls that far in the draft, because he's not going anywhere outside of the top 5. He might go number 1 overall. I don't know. Because of how good he is in every single statistical category. But that's enough of the star players. How about a little love for an unsung hero on a LA Lakers team that kind of is so LeBron and Anthony Davis and media-centric that you forget about this guy in Austin Reeves as he pops up on my screen. Austin Reeves is just a fantastic utility player in my mindset. I think he's a guy who can come in off the bench and offer you production at every level, especially in terms of his point scoring. I think he's helped by the fact that he has that nucleus in LeBron and AD that really propels his style of play, really makes him more aggressive, and I'm loving how he's progressing. I think that there might be questions about his future. If there's a new coach who doesn't necessarily see him as a fit for this LA Lakers team. I know it's crazy because he has signed a contract extension, and he deserved it in my opinion. But right now, I do feel that Austin Reeves is just getting a little bit overlooked, and in my mind's eye is the MVP of the past basketball season as one of those role players who can do it all. He does have a very low average draft position going into the 24 to 25 season, so He's one of those guys who, unlike a Wemby and Luka, who obviously are going to go very high, is going to fall down fantasy draft boards. People might forget about him because they don't necessarily think he's an integral point guard in the league. But he certainly can be a fantastic sleeper pick, in my opinion. So do not sleep on Austin Reeves. Now let's transition to the sadder portion of this segment. The disappointments. The guys who maybe if they saw the court a bit more could have huge impacts. And let's start off with a guy who has caused controversy wherever he has gone in the NBA with Jordan Poole. Jordan Poole, he does have an average draft position of 28, so kind of in that mid-first to late second round draft pick. But he was still outside the top 60 in points league's scorers for this past season. And in my mind's eye, I just don't see Jordan Poole as a factor anymore. He just lived off the hype of his season with the Golden State Warriors where they beat the Celtics in the finals. And after that, he was not heard of again. He was more known for getting punched by Draymond Green than producing on the floor. I think that Jordan Poole right now, in my mind's eye, is not even a factor. He's insignificant in my mind in terms of fantasy draft boards. And so I think he's very invaluable to fantasy boards. He doesn't necessarily add anything to them. Not even as a bench or role player anymore. I just think that he has fallen off that much. And I don't see as bright a future as I do for the next two guys on this list as I do for Jordan Poole. Okay, next two guys on this list are two guys who I think could have bright futures in terms of both how they play in real life if they see the court more, in both Ben Simmons and LaMelo Ball, who just were seen as kind of like these nice little fantasy prospects. Obviously, Ben Simmons is not a point-scoring fantasy prospect, more known for his assists, rebounds, stuff of that nature, but LaMelo Ball certainly was as well. And so let's start off with Ben Simmons. Obviously, this is the second back surgery he's undergone ever since joining the Nets from Philly. He has played just 57 minutes since he was traded and acquired by the Nets. So it just goes to show that Ben Simmons just cannot seem to find a purple patch of health. He cannot seem to find a purple patch where he's actually helping the Brooklyn Nets. Obviously, it did not work out. That whole kind of controversy with the whole Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, James Harden, all these players segueing in and out of the Brooklyn lineup, and Ben Simmons just being left there to kind of rot is kind of a sad thing to see, because I do think Ben Simmons is one of the more interesting players. He is so efficient when he's on the court. He can provide so many unique stats and elements to fantasy that are so unexpected, and yet he just cannot seem to find a purple patch of health, like I said. Whereas LaMelo, he was projecting to average 47 fantasy points per game. He was sitting right at that tally, and that's a fantastic mark for a starter-level player on a fantasy squad. But he only played 22 games last year. LaMelo Ball is also on a Charlotte Hornets team that ultimately can be exciting in spurts, but really are reliant on LaMelo, so he is one of the preeminent point scorers in this league due to the fact the Charlotte Hornets mainly rely on him. But he just was not healthy last year. He just did not have a purple patch. But look for him in kind of like the mid-second round, in my opinion. I think that LaMelo Ball should be one of the more highly valued fantasy players next season. Let's just hope he stays healthy, because he really is a special athlete when he's on the court. And I do think he is a starter-level player in terms of fantasy, should he have a full season of health. But that will just about do it for this segment. I really enjoyed kind of recapping the fantasy basketball, kind of bittersweet moment in this kind of podcast because of the fact we're winding down on the basketball season, and we're going to be getting into fantasy football as we saw this episode. But I was really excited about this show. I hope you guys liked it. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC both sports and podcast networks. It's a huge support. It is highly appreciated by all, so do consider that. Also, if you want to leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud, another huge support as well, and greatly appreciated. But that should just about do it for this series of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. My name is Christopher Shepard. We will be back tomorrow for another fantastic edition of this show.